difficulties. We've been bantering about a little bit here, and I'm supposed to tell a joke. I'm not very good at telling jokes, but we kind of were talking about how 1927 Ford technology might be a little more reliable than what we've got going on here today. But we're going to jump back just a little bit in the presentation, so because we're not 100% sure what we all got. So we're going to jump back, and I apologize if you heard it, but we're going to talk about the Tachibana Maru. And so the Tachibana Maru was a hospital ship that was captured near the end of World War II. And this was not really a hospital ship, it was a ruse. The Japanese Army was, or Navy rather, was transporting healthy soldiers and arms and ammunitions back to the front lines. And they were doing it against the Geneva Convention and transporting these things as if they were hospital and wounded soldiers. So the U.S. Navy was tipped off a little bit about this, and they carefully approached the ship with two large naval ships, and they boarded that. And certainly they found very healthy soldiers, and they found a lot of weaponry. And one account that I read was actually very interesting, where it talked about how the soldiers who were on the ship, the Japanese soldiers, probably didn't know what they were transporting. They were sleeping on all of these huge crates, and likely if they had understood what they were sleeping on, they may have opened those crates and may have dispatched the U.S. Navy very quickly. So from the U.S. perspective, this was a very fortunate and very successful mission. So we just recently had some really unique and wonderful pieces that were donated to the Museum of Idaho. It's called the Belter Collection, and it comes from a man who was actually one of those soldiers who boarded the Tachibana Maru. And so I wanted to show you a couple of things. So these images that you can see here, many of these images are actually, they were taken by the U.S. Navy, by these soldiers who just had cameras with them, and they were taking pictures of what they encountered as they boarded this ship. And then you'll also notice on there that there's a small artifact, and it almost looks kind of like a coconut shell, and something strange is in it. Well, those are hand-rolled cigarettes, and those were taken from the ship. And those cigarettes are still intact and are indeed in this container that's been donated to the museum. I brought with me another piece that was taken off the ship. So this piece is very interesting because it's a box. Then it's a little hard to see from where you are, but there are little carvings that have been done on this box, and probably these carvings were made by the soldier who this belonged to. Right here is a dispenser, and so this actually dispenses some more of those hand-rolled cigarettes. This doesn't have any of those cigarettes in it like the other container did, but it did at one time. And so many of the members of the Navy who boarded this ship, once they had taken all of the Japanese soldiers off, then they kind of went through and looked at some of the things that were left. And after they had cataloged all of the arms and ammunitions and the things that needed to go to the U.S. Navy, I don't know that we'd want to say they took spoils of war, but they did take some remembrances of this incident and their experience participating in this. It did make a big impact in changing the tenor of the war. And war is a very complicated thing. And, you know, what is going on the battlefront is very different sometimes than what's going on the home front. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on the home front as well. So we have been very fortunate to work with some members from the National Park Service who work at Minidoka, which was an incarceration camp of Japanese Americans here in Idaho. It's over near Burley area, if you don't know where it is, and it's kind of a somber place to go and visit. And And it was a place where we incarcerated thousands of our fellow Americans, and out of fear. And we did this because we didn't understand how they may look different than us. We didn't understand how they may be different than us, even though they are fellow citizens. And in many cases, they were our friends and our neighbors. But fear drove us to do something that was very complex and very difficult during the war. So we have been very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Minidoka and to learn more of these stories so that we can learn and understand a little bit of our response to that, and hopefully how we can learn how to change and how to be a little bit different as we move forward, and how this can impact us today. That's one of the things that I think is so significant and wonderful about history, is this complex texture of history. And we have this complex texture right here in our community, right here in our state, where we can kind of see these different perspectives. We see different sides of a coin. But maybe as we learn to investigate a little bit of this history, we can learn a little bit about ourselves, and maybe learn a little bit about our innate prejudices or our innate tendencies towards how we treat our neighbor and our community. Moving on from that theme, just a little bit more here on the home front. This is an image that's in our collection at the museum, and I love this picture. This is a picture from 1948, from when Harry Truman was on the campaign trail, and he came to Idaho Falls and was campaigning here in Idaho Falls. And here at the back of a railroad car, you can see him with Fred Ochi. And many of you may be aware of Fred Ochi and the impact that Fred had on our community. Fred was a remarkable man. I wish I had known him. I have had the opportunity to spend some time with his son, John, and to learn a little bit more about Fred, and I am glad for that opportunity. Fred was born in California. He is Japanese American, but he was born here in this country and lived in California. He did spend a little bit of time, as was typical with many Japanese families. His parents sent him and his brother back to Japan for a little bit to live with relatives and to learn a little bit about their home culture. While he was there, he learned calligraphy and he learned art. And he came back and actually he was able to begin interning for free, not paid, for many, many years with a film studio, where he learned how to draw and how to illustrate, and he illustrated a number of marquees and drew paintings and created paintings that would hang in movie theaters. At the start of World War II, when many of the Japanese were moved from the coasts in the evacuation zones, Fred was part of that movement. He was not sent to one of the incarceration camps, but he did migrate out to Idaho, and he was still working for film studios, and he came out here, and he was kind of working between Nampa and Idaho Falls a little bit. But in Nampa, he actually, at a couple of points, had to be protected and safeguarded by armed National Guardsmen who were protecting him because there were threats against his life and against the movie theater for importing Japs. And he found that Nampa was not very sensitive to him, and so he kind of settled here in Idaho Falls, where the community was more accepting of him. Fred, as many of you know, was able to establish a wonderful art business here. He was one of the founding members of the Eagle Rock Art Guild, and was a watercolorist for over 60 years, as well as had a great sign business. I love when I walk by our old doors in the Carnegie Library portion of the museum, and we're able to see our sign that is painted by Fred Ochi. I brought with me today the painting that he did while he was standing on that platform with Harry Truman. See if I can show this for just a moment. This is a really special piece of our collection. Fred donated it himself to our collection, so it's been at the museum for a number of years. But as sometimes happens, hopefully not under my watch as curator, but as sometimes happens, things sort of are misplaced a little bit. And this painting actually was kind of misplaced, and it suffered some significant water damage. Unfortunately, many of the people who were at the museum when this became a part of the collection aren't around anymore to help me piece together all the pieces of the story, but I suspect that it suffered water damage when the Bonneville County Museum had a flood, and I suspect that it was taken off display at that time, and they just sort of lost track of it. And sometimes they didn't know what to do with it. So as we found this wonderful artifact and are working to incorporate this in our upcoming exhibit, we found that it had some damage that was done to it. And I have conservation training, but works of art like this are not necessarily within my toolkit, and so we were really fortunate to work with Pam at Casey Frames, and she was able to help us with some conservation of this piece. And it's been reframed according to museum standards, and we've staved off any possible mold that was on it, and we've really been able to preserve this piece for our community for the foreseeable future. One of the things that I love in stories about Fred Ochi was that and all the pictures that I see of him, is that he was smiling. This picture where he's meeting with Harry Truman, he was kind of in the crowd, and there was kind of a hubbub, and Harry Truman acknowledged him and said, "Hey, come on up here." And Fred said, "I'm going to draw a picture of you." And that's what he did right at that moment. And we are so fortunate to be able to preserve this moment. Fred apparently, and if any of you have one of these and want to help it make its way to the museum, I know that Fred at one time, he had some business cards where he would put his name as Fred O'Shea, the Laughing Irishman. And a little bit to sort of lighten the mood, but also to detract a little bit from his ethnic heritage, which, even though this was a more inviting place than Nampa, he still faced a lot of disparaging remarks that came his way, which is unfortunate. But it is one of those things that I think is really important for us as a community to think about. I think it's really important for us to consider how we treat our neighbors, how we treat those who are in business with us, how we're talking and thinking about others. It's on my mind right now as we're in this time of upheaval, and I think it's really important as a community that we find ways to grow together instead of finding things that push us apart. And that's one of the lessons that I've learned from learning about Fred and learning a little bit about the way that he lived life was with a positive attitude and a way that was trying to bring people together, whether it was through his art or whether it was through his humor. But he was finding a way to forge relationships. And so I want to move with that into some other relationships that we have been really fortunate to forge at the museum. We've been working very closely with some members of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes at Fort Hall, and I have learned so much in my interactions with them. You can see here a couple of members of the tribe. One of particular note is Daisy Dixie. She's an elder with the tribe, and Daisy has created a couple of really beautiful pieces that are going to be highlighted at the museum. In the image here, you can see a wonderful sagebrush dress. This is a traditional dress that would have been typical for women to wear prior to contact with Euro-Americans. And so this is a very ancient tradition, an old tradition that is kept alive by some of the elders in the Shoban. And they went out this spring. Daisy in particular, she went out and harvested. She told me that to harvest the sagebrush for this dress, you need to find the biggest sagebrush that's out there. And so she was harvesting long, long strips, as long as she could get them. And then she would wash and dry and wash and dry and make this sagebrush actually very soft and pliable, which which it seems like, when you're wearing bark, that might be really scratchy, but apparently it's not too bad. And when we've handled it, it really isn't all that scratchy, and it is pretty soft. But really what it does is it creates this beautiful artifact and helps the show band to be able to remember many of these traditions that are fading away quickly because culture changes and it adapts, and these are some traditions that are significant for them to remember. One of the things that's important to remember about it is that the Shoshone and Bannock groups, they have traditionally been a very nomadic people where they have seasonal cycles that they would follow. And with those seasonal cycles, they were able to find resources all around. So whether they were going to fish at a certain season, or whether they were hunting, or whether they were harvesting berries, or moving through large swaths of land, covering huge places, and knowing how to go from place to place by being guided by elders, remembering, understanding the landscape in a way that I can't understand the landscape, and knowing landmarks that bring them back to the same place for thousands and thousands of years. They truly have this deep understanding of this area and of the resources that provide sustenance and create a vibrant and wonderful culture. I think the sagebrush dress is a really beautiful example of that. I wanted to bring a second thing that Daisy brought and that she made, and this is a rabbit blanket. Daisy wore it for me, and it is just beautiful. So this is made of, I can't remember how many rabbit pelts that she said this took, but they harvest a number of rabbit pelts, and then they strip them and twist them and weave them together. This is all woven together. It's quite heavy, and it's quite warm, and it's really spectacularly beautiful. But it's also very useful. One of the things that Daisy told me was that this was not necessarily something that they would take with them on all of their sustenance journey. It was something that was useful for a time, and they wore out, and they would leave it. And then when they had need of it again, they would know where to come back to be able to find this resource again. And, I don't come across too many rabbits in my daily life, but I have come across some really amazing pictures in our archives. And rabbits used to be here in abundance. They were a bit of a nuisance for a lot of the people here, and in fact there were rabbit drives early on to try and get rid of some of the nuisance of the rabbits. But I think it's interesting to consider how it was a nuisance for farmers, and yet this was a very reliable and needed resource, not just for the blanket, but as a food resource for the Shoshone and Bannock peoples for thousands and thousands of years. So again, there's an interesting way, as we're looking at our histories and we're looking at our resources, how we tend to view things, and whether we're viewing things in a holistic view and seeing how our neighbors view things, or whether we're just seeing things from our viewpoint. It's been such a joy for me to be able to have my eyes open to so many new perspectives, and to be able to understand and see so much richness in our community. So I want to move on to just this last element that I wanted to talk about legacy and tradition. So you can see here in this image is an artist. He's a member of the Bannock Nation and many other, a few other tribes as well, but his name is Pete Yellowjohn. Pete resides at Fort Hall. And we were really fortunate to be able to work with Pete also on a piece that is going to be at the museum. And I brought that today. You can see an image of it here. But I actually wanted to bring it just because I think that artifacts sometimes, when they're not in a picture, and even though we're on film, so maybe you could get a good perspective of this, and maybe the size, I think that artifacts have a way of connecting us to something. And when I talked with Pete, that was really his goal for this piece. We commissioned this piece and asked him to create it for the exhibit, but there were no parameters on what kind of art would show up on this. And part of that is because of Pete's perspective on his art. when he creates this, he makes the frame and then he stretches the rawhide and he waits for that rawhide to speak to him. He waits for the images to sort of emerge and for this to come to life. This is created with all natural elements. So he went and gathered different plants and different minerals that would create the pigments that he uses here. And then, so he did that while this was kind of drying and preparing. On the back, you can see this wonderful dream catcher that he created. One of the things that's interesting is that he mentioned that this isn't necessarily a design that is native or internalized within him, but it is something that is internalized within him because of the collective nature of many Native American peoples. And so he incorporates this. This is not what all the backs of drums look like, but these are the backs of what Pete's drums look like. And I think it's really beautiful. So he waits for this to sort of speak to him. And the way that this drum spoke to him was about horse culture. So he said that the first thing that came to him was this beautiful image right here of this horse sort of coming out of the drum, and as a reminder of this significant past and this significant culture and the meaning of the horse to the Shoshone and Bannock peoples. And then he has these warriors here who are preparing for their hunt, again, utilizing the horse. And he spoke about how important it was for him to remind his tribes that this is part of their heritage and not to forget this, that the horse has deep meaning to them, not just as something that helps facilitate a hunt, but it really is part of their soul and part of who they are as a people. And so he was hoping that this drum would create a memory for the Shoshone and Bannock peoples, as well as help to educate those of us who are Euro-American a little bit about their history and about the significance of this part of their culture. It's been a rich experience for me. I have enjoyed every moment of learning about all of these different stories, all of these things that really do help to create this wonderful, rich texture in our community. And it's one of the things that I love so much about working at the museum, and one of the things that I enjoy so much about this cabinet of curiosities that we have there, is that these artifacts have a way to help us see different perspectives. They have a way to help us connect to time and place. They have an opportunity to help us connect to who we are and to help build and grow our community. I would just put out there that there are ways for you to be involved with the museum. There are ways for you to connect with the museum. There are ways for you to sponsor, to volunteer, to come and visit. And we would encourage you to do that. We're hoping that we're going to be able to open this exhibit near the end of this year. Clearly with COVID, things have slowed down a bit, but we're hoping that we'll be able to open soon and you'll be able to come and experience and see all of these artifacts firsthand. But in the meantime, if you ever have a question or you ever want a way to feel connected to the museum, contact us, get in touch with us. And I think that let's find ways together to really build our community and build these connections and find a way to continue the vibrant history that we have here and continue these wonderful community relations that we have. I think I don't know if we've had any questions, and I don't know if we have time for it. Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Carrie. Just thank you for reminding us what a great resource we have in our local museum, the Museum of Idaho, and also for reminding us what we can learn from our own history in the area. I think that as you were talking about fear, that has some relevance to today and what we can learn from our past and our history and some of the mistakes we've made. And as Rotarians, I think as you were talking, it reminded me of our four-way test. And of the things that we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? And will it be beneficial to all concerned? Is a good standard for us to use during times that fear may make us do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. And so I think being a Rotarian and going back to some of those historical foundations from our founder, Paul Harris, and looking at some of those fundamental documents in the history of Rotary can be a good guide for us as we go through our challenging times that our country's going through currently. And it's so important that we can learn from the past. And what a great theme for this month in terms of what an amazing community we have and what amazing resources we have. And then my final comment to all of you out there that are still online is remember my challenge to go check out myrotary.org, create yourself an account, and explore that website. And so you can learn more about the history of Rotary and how we can take that history and move forward together as a community. And with that, thank you all for watching. And it's been another great Idaho Falls Community Luncheon with the Rotary Club. Thank you.